50% das vagas nas universidades do Estado para estudantes formados em escolas públicas, com reserva de uma parcela mínima destas vagas para os afrodescendentes e indígenas. E aumento do número de bolsas de estudo para alunos com este perfil nas universidades privadas. Está em discussão no Congresso o projeto de lei com que o governo pretende solucionar provisoriamente a demanda por ensino superior no Brasil. Há 4 décadas, nos Estados Unidos, esta é a política de ações afirmativas, implantada como importante instrumento de combate ao racismo contra os negros americanos. Mas nem todos estão de acordo com ela. O economista americano Sowell é um inimigo declarado da ação afirmativa. Dedicou grande parte de sua obra a provar que ela tem efeitos negativos para as próprias minorias que pretende beneficiar, além de prejudicar a sociedade como um todo. Em seu último livro, Ação Afirmativa ao Redor do Mundo, que está sendo publicado no Brasil pela editora Universidade, Sowell analisa as experiências de países como Índia, Ceilão, Paquistão e Nigéria. E conclui que, em todos os casos, leis para promover a igualdade tiveram um efeito oposto. Sowell recebeu o repórter Jorge Pontual na Universidade de Stanford, na Califórnia, onde conduz suas pesquisas.
You have looked closely at the results of programs for affirmative action in many countries, and in none you have seen success. Why that?
Well, most of the time, the things that people want, university admissions, high-level jobs, and so forth, are things for which you have to have prerequisites. And the people who are already more fortunate have those prerequisites, and those who are poor typically don't. And so it doesn't do any good to have a reserve a place for people of one group or another in a medical school when the person who's poor is very unlikely to have reached the point where he'll ever get to the medical school application process. And so you get a very disproportionate amount of the benefits going to a very small and already more fortunate group. It's a wonderful way for people who are affluent to become rich, but that is not the social problem in most of these countries.
The first laws that created group preferences were adopted in India by the British colonial administration. What happened there?
One result has been that these preferences have spread far beyond the untouchables. Most of the untouchables have gotten nothing out of this. Those relatively few already affluent untouchables have gotten the lion's share of the benefits. And the other groups, who are much more fortunate than the untouchables, they have really gotten far more of the preferences than the untouchables ever did.
But what happened in India, was there an increase in violence between the groups, between races and different groups?
Oh yes, there's been great increased violence, particularly against the untouchables.
Why?
Because they are perceived as having an unfair advantage, even though the great bulk of them get nothing out of this. One of the tragic cases of some years ago was a riot in which 42 people were killed over 6 places in a medical school in Gujarat. Moreover, most of the places that are set aside for untouchables go unfilled because they don't have enough of them who are qualified to get into these places, even with lower qualification standards. But so they get the brunt of the hostility, but they don't get the bulk of the benefits.
Because other groups feel discriminated.
Other groups find that this is a way they can get preferences, whether they're discriminated against or not. And so they do. And politically, it's always easier to add another group to the list. And of course, the more groups you add, the more you dilute the preferences for those who really were truly badly off to begin with.
How have the different programs of affirmative action that you looked into been detrimental to society at large and to the groups targeted?
Certainly the antagonism is a high cost to the society at large. It's a high cost to the members of the group. You also have the members of these groups who have, with great effort in many cases, elevated themselves on the basis of their own qualifications. And they go under a cloud in any case. That is, if some black student, for example, graduates #1 in his class in Harvard, he will still go out into the world under the cloud that he only got in because he was black. Now, he may have gotten in whether he was black or not, but we will never know that because there will then be this general presumption of less competence.
One example that you studied is Sri Lanka, a country that was very peaceful and then affirmative action programs for the Tamil minority were adopted, and what happened there?
Well, it was not only peaceful, it was held up by many people inside and outside Sri Lanka as a model for the rest of the world, to show how a majority and a minority could live together in peace. There was not a single race riot between the Tamils and the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka during the first half of the 20th century. During the second half of the 20th century, there were not only riots, there was outright civil war. And this little country lost more lives during its civil war than the United States lost during all the years of the Vietnam War.
But how was affirmative action involved in that?
The Tamils were doing better than the Sinhalese, the Tamil minority, for a number of historical reasons. And the Sinhalese resented that. When the country became free and began to have elections, one of the politicians decided his best chance to become prime minister was to push for preferences for the Sinhalese. And of course, once he did that, that made life impossible for the Tamils. Because where the Tamils lived was a very poor part of the country, and without being able to get into an education and into the professions, they really had very little future. Eventually, the Tamils decided they wanted to secede, and so civil war broke out. And only in the past couple of years has there been a ceasefire in that civil war, very belatedly after decades of slaughter.
It seems from your studies that in all those countries that adopted those programs of racial quotas, politicians used that. There was a lot of demagoguery involved. Why?
Well, it's always easy to say, particularly when it's some group that isn't performing as well as another group, to blame somebody else. People would much rather believe that their misfortunes are due to somebody else rather than to themselves. In many cases, their misfortunes may be due to historical factors over which they had no control. But the fact is that if they want to advance from where they are, they're going to have to acquire skills and do other kinds of things that are necessary. This is a distraction from that. This says to people, you don't have to measure up to what other people do. They owe it to you, and therefore you're to get this anyway. It's a double-edged thing, because not only do they usually not get very much out of it all, the slackening of their own efforts probably does them more harm than any benefits they're going to be given by the government.
The advocates of affirmative action claim that it has been one of the main factors for the creation of a black middle class in the U.S. Is that true?
No. The easiest way to look at that is that the black middle class existed before affirmative action existed. It has not grown faster under affirmative action. In fact, if you go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the number of blacks rising into professional and other high-level occupations was greater in the 5 years prior to that legislation than in the 5 years following that legislation. So the black middle class grew primarily out of the black colleges where there was no affirmative action. And even to this day, in some of the scientific fields, the bulk of black PhDs came out of the black colleges, not out of the Harvards and Yales and other such places.
In Brazil, affirmative action is being introduced in universities. In the American universities, what has been the effect of affirmative action?
You've had a very high failure rate among the minority students brought in. And it's not because these students weren't qualified. At Berkeley, for example, during the era of affirmative action, over half the black students failed to graduate. Now, the average black student at Berkeley during that period scored higher than the average American student in the country at large. They were failing because they were at Berkeley, where you had the top, 10% of white students and the top 5% of Asian students. And so they were just simply overwhelmed. I mean, I saw this when it first came in Cornell, that there were many black kids there who would have sailed through and graduated with honors somewhere else. It's just that you can't make up in a few years for what you don't have otherwise. In my own classes, I gave a lot of reading assignments. Now, the average student at Cornell at that time had an SAT of 700, which meant they were fantastic readers. They could just go right through a book at high speed and know all of it. Very few people in the world can do that. Now, along comes a black student who's let in under affirmative action. He's a good student. He does well, but he can't do that, as most white students can't do that. But he's put into Cornell, and so we go whizzing along, and he's left behind. He doesn't learn things that he is perfectly capable of learning if it's taught at a normal pace.
But why wouldn't the black student be able to do that?
Oh, not as good a previous education. I mean, it's one thing if you've been through Andover or Exeter or any of these other high-priced schools and you've been taught all this. It's another thing if you come out of a ghetto school where the standards are much lower, and after 12 years of that, you can't make that up in a summer or in any other period of time that's going to get you through a high-powered school with the kind of results that you really want.
What has happened in California and Texas, the two largest American states, where the voters abolished affirmative action a few years ago?
There were great outcries that there would be no minority students in the university system and so on. In point of fact, there are now more minority students in the university system than there were prior to the ending of affirmative action. They redistributed themselves. There are fewer minority students in Berkeley. There are more at the other universities in the same system. And so I suspect that the rate of graduation is going to go up now that the students are in places where they belong rather than being put in places where they're overmatched.
Has affirmative action in the U.S. improved the educational level of black students?
No, I know no evidence of that. One of the sad cases, MIT, for example, a study done some years ago showed that the average black student at MIT was in the top 10% of the nation's students in mathematics, and in the bottom 10% at MIT. And 1/4 of them flunked out. Now, when you consider how few black students have had an opportunity to develop their skills to the point where they're in the top 10% mathematically in the country at large, and to flunk 1/4 of them out is a crime. And they're flunking only because they're at MIT, where people are in the top 1%. And so, therefore, being in the 90th percentile doesn't count for very much there.
What is this phenomenon that happens in the U.S. among the black youth, where if you work hard, if you study hard, you're seen as acting white?
Yes, it's tragic. You didn't have that in my generation. That's a new thing, and it's part of the vision behind the whole civil rights affirmative action issue. The argument is, you see, that whites have their positions solely because they're able to repress blacks. Now, if that's true, if it's true that no matter what you do, the white population is going to keep you from getting ahead, then it really makes no sense to knock yourself out. It makes no sense to study hard. And the people who do that are regarded as being dupes, if not traitors. And so, given what people have been saying, what so-called black leaders have been saying, the black students' responses are perfectly rational. It's just that what the leaders are saying is utter nonsense. Many of the leaders themselves are now appalled at the consequences, but the consequences follow logically from what they themselves have been saying.
Going back to your studies of several countries, you showed that even though those programs are not successful, they become entrenched. It's very difficult to get rid of them. Why?
Because they're successful for some people, and they're successful for those who are more fortunate, who are typically better educated, more organized. And it's always easier for a politician to say yes than to say no. I mean, once they're in place, if you take them away, there are people who never got a thing out of those things who will resent your taking them away. People who have never gained anything and have no prospect of gaining anything will nevertheless resent it. And so therefore you don't say no. And some other group comes along and they come up with a reason why they should get these very same preferences. And you say, yeah, sure, why not? And so you expand, ever expanding over time. These programs are put in often with the notion that they're temporary. They are never temporary. They not only persist, they expand.
Those who propose affirmative action, they argue that when you look at a specific sphere of activity and the proportion of the different races is not exactly the same as in society at large, it means there is discrimination. What do you think of that argument?
It's utter nonsense. I spent 15 years researching racial and ethnic groups around the world. I couldn't find a single country anywhere where racial and ethnic groups are proportionally represented. In some cases, in many cases, in fact, there's some minority that is far more fortunate than the general majority. And yet they cannot have gotten where they are by discriminating against the majority because they don't have the power to do that. You can look at the Chinese in Malaysia or Indonesia, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Igbos in northern Nigeria, the Germans in Sao Paulo. All these groups had no power to discriminate against other people. They came in and they simply outperformed them for a number of historical reasons. When you think of all the factors that go into economic success or anything else, any other kind of achievement, it would be incredible if they balanced out the same for all groups. I mean, if you just look at people who live on different sides of a mountain range, on one side of the mountain range you may get 10 times the water you get on the other side. There's no way you can grow the same crops in both places.
In a broader sense, racial and group preferences, they represent a form of social engineering. You've written that social engineering like that has been a quiet way of undoing the American Revolution. Why? Is it anti-democratic?
Oh, yes, it's that. But the American Revolution is really based on a notion that people will have rights, and that's the pursuit of happiness. You are free to pursue happiness and to go as far as your particular desires and abilities will take you, which is very different from saying that somebody sitting on top will then place you in the position that that person thinks you ought to be in. When you think of it, it would take some sort of godlike knowledge to be able to do that. One thing, people don't want to do the same things. I mean, no one could make me the equal of Rudolph Nureyev on a ballet stage. It never occurred to me to want to do ballet. How could he possibly do that? So that it can't be done from the beginning. But the attempt to do it can have an incredible amount of damage done.
I've heard people say that even though they admit that affirmative action has a lot of shortcomings, it's important symbolically as reparation for slavery. What do you think of that?
The question is, how high a price do you want to pay for symbolism? And particularly, how high a price do you want those who are supposed to be the beneficiaries to pay for the symbolism? Because affirmative action has had the bad effects that I mentioned on blacks themselves, in terms of making it appear that you don't have to build up your own skills. I mean, there have been studies which find black students, who are in college and thinking of graduate school, and people say, well, are you preparing yourself for whatever the field is? Oh, no, because they'll let me in otherwise. Well, for a while they might, but at some point they won't. And so you let a whole lifetime of opportunities slip by, depending on something that's going to be illusory in the long run.
I've heard one white scholar say that for him it's aesthetically good to have a few black faces around in his classes. It sounds even as a racist comment. What do you think of that?
It is, and what they're saying is that the black students are acting, they're in the role of movie extras. They're in the background while the stars perform their acts. And that's really what role blacks play on too many campuses. Places like Berkeley, for example, for many years went under affirmative action. That they came in, they lasted as long as they lasted, and they left. And most of them left without a degree. And so, yes, when the administrator is showing visitors around, he can point to the grand complexity of faces out there, which is very lovely for him. But the kids, many of whom are the first members of their family ever to go to college, they have no idea that they are being used as extras as a backdrop.
There's an idea in Brazil that affirmative action should not be for blacks but for the poor. It's a form of affirmative action. Is that as bad as the racial quota?
You have exactly the same problem. That the problem is not that people aren't qualified, certainly in the United States at least. We have so many different levels of colleges and universities. Anyone who is able to read is qualified somewhere. The question is, get him where that person can function. Affirmative action simply systematically mismatches minorities with the institutions. So you get someone flunking out of Berkeley who would have sailed through fine at San Jose State. And so the very same thing would apply if you did it by income level. That you would take some person because he has a low income and you'd put him someplace where the standards are beyond what his preparation qualifies him for. And he's going to have a terrible struggle, at the end of which he's probably going to lose. He will lose all that time and all the agony and whatnot that will go with that.
From what you know of Brazil, and you've studied Brazil a lot, I've seen in your books, what do you think the effects of the introduction of affirmative action could be?
Oh, I suspect very much what they've been for other groups in other countries. One, you get more polarization. Those blacks who are more fortunate will undoubtedly do much better as a result. You'll get the son of the black doctor will get into medical school ahead of the son of the white doctor. But the problem with blacks is not the problem of finding jobs for the sons of black doctors. They're going to do all right anyway. It's the people who are much further down the ladder. Those are the people who need, first of all, you need to have education of a decent quality at a much earlier age. You cannot give an inferior education for 12 years and then give someone preferential admission to a university just so they can go there and fail. Almost all these programs focus on things that the elite would like to have: university admissions, professional jobs, government jobs, and so on. But the people who are at the bottom, what they most need is marketable skills, educational standards, and so forth. And that's what gets neglected.
On a more personal note, what have been your experiences with racism? I saw in your book that you never took offense easily. You were really fighting those racists, right?
Oh, heavens, I hated Washington, D.C. when I first went there in 1950 because it was a segregated town. The only difference between Washington at that point and the Deep South was that blacks did not have to sit in the back of the buses. But other than that, even the most petty restaurant downtown, blacks couldn't come in and sit down. Blacks in some places could come in and stand up but not sit down, and so forth. So I really despised it. But what most people don't realize is that all of that was beginning to change even before the courts began to act. I remember when I was in the Marine Corps, I came to Washington in 1952, and my sister met me at Union Station there. And I said, "Where can we eat in this miserable town?" And she said, "We can eat right here in Union Station." I said, "You're kidding." And she said, "No." And so it was already beginning to unravel. The moral authority of racism was already undermined, and the political and judicial things followed in their wake. I remember going to a meeting of the American Economic Association in St. Louis in 1960. St. Louis at that time was a racially segregated town. Special arrangements were made that in the hotel where the convention was held, there would be none of that black and white economists could all go there fine. I go out walking, and I stop there, not thinking. I walk into a restaurant and sit down, and I see a big discussion back in the kitchen. And then it dawns on me, of course, they're wondering what is a black man doing here at this restaurant, for heaven's sake. But the waitress came out and sort of timidly asked what I wanted, and I said, "Oh, a glass of milk and a piece of pie." And that was the end of it. Now, 10 years earlier, I'd have been thrown out of there, you see. So it was already, the underpinnings were already being undermined. It reminds me of something that I've read about Brazil in the last days of slavery, that the moral support for it had so eroded away that slaves began walking off the plantations, secure that the public would not return them because there was just too much opposition to it in the country at large. And I think that was what was happening in the United States at that time.
But nowadays, even though there's a lot of progress, there's still a lot of poverty, ingrained poverty among blacks. How do you see the situation now?
A lot depends on what you call poverty. I mean, I consider myself something of an expert on poverty in that I grew up in it. And I don't see people in the ghettos today living the way I lived. I mean, when I was a little kid down south, I mean, to us, you know, we didn't have hot and cold running water. Well, we didn't have electricity, you know, stuff like that. And now I hear people complaining because the pizza people will not deliver in all the neighborhoods. And I think, my gosh, the very thought that someone would cook your food and bring it to your home, it would never have crossed our minds. And so I'm not sure how much poverty in that sense there is. I think there's a desperate effort to keep poverty alive by people who profit by it. Because I mean, it's people often complain about, you know, natural resources being exhausted and so on. Poverty is the natural resource of a whole class of political and community activist people, and to see the poverty eroding away in front of them is really must be very alarming to them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.